A compelling detective story, a cloak and dagger action, and a romantic drama, all these stories were taken from real life. The history of Kazakhstan is inseparable from the world history. Reflections on history, our version.
To stop the typhoon, keeping an oath. Moscow is behind us. Stand at their post. Those who are not afraid of typhoons. The lines from Borodino found a special response in our hearts. Fellows, Moscow is behind us. Let's die for Moscow. Yes, the capital was behind us. It was very close, just 200 kilometers away. Ivan Starchak, From Heaven to Battle. The Battle of Borodino is reconstructed every year. Memorable lines since childhood. Let's die for Moscow just like our grandfathers did, and we promised to die, and we kept the oath. In distant 1812, soldiers of the Kutuzov army walked down this road. A century later, the soldiers of the Soviet army followed in their footsteps. 122 days, from October the 2nd of 1941 to January the 31st of 1942, one of the bloodiest battles in the history of mankind took place, with little-known episodes, incredible stories, and amazing facts. The battle for Moscow involved people from Kazakhstan to stop the typhoon. The fate of Moscow hung by a thread. This was October and November. Many brave deeds were not recorded. The best Komsomol members were chosen for the defense of Moscow. Chapter 1. Keeping an Oath. A precondition has been created for a huge blow, which before the onset of winter must lead to the destruction of the enemy. Today begins the last decisive battle of this year. Adolf Hitler, from an order to the troops on the Eastern Front on October the 2nd, 1941. The operation called Typhoon was prepared over 8 weeks. On August the 4th, 1941, Hitler approved it. The goal was a complete rout of the forces of the Western Reserve and Bryansk fronts. All information about military movements was classified and kept secret. So much so that Soviet intelligence and the specialists of the General Staff could not figure out where, when, and how Hitler's troops would strike. It's a political advisor, Klochkov, with his daughter. I'm going to fight for the future of my daughter, Klochkov said. Russia is great and there's nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us. These lines are the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to this battle. Warsaw Highway, then the Panfilov Guardsmen. There was the Panfilov Guardsmen's brave act. Maybe there were more than 28 guardsmen. The fact that the Panfilov Division fighters stopped the tank columns is a fact. Not only the glorified 316th Division defended its honor. During the war, our Kazakhstani soldiers defended Moscow, which was the heart of the Soviet Union. In Kazakhstan, in the first period of the war, 14 divisions and 6 brigades were formed. Warriors from Kokshetau, Akmolinsk, Zhambul, Aktyabinsk. 312. In 2 weeks of fighting, more than 10,000 of its fighters were left in the forest near Moscow. Forever. 5 rifle and cavalry divisions, 3 brigades from Kazakhstan faced their death near Moscow. The 238th Rifle Division took part in the most difficult battles at Tula. It was the most difficult period of the Moscow battle in October 1941. October 41, for several days, fascists were crossing the front line towards Moscow in many directions, but they did not meet a single Soviet soldier. Another 5 to 6 hours in the tank, and there it is, the Red Square, where the Nazi army planned to hold a victory parade. They were already dressed in their dress uniforms. For a week, fascist troops planned to have a riot, open all the warehouses, and arrange a feast for the whole world. Moscow had to disappear from the map of the planet. But those who defended Moscow had their own plans. Sometimes they didn't agree on certain plans with the Set General Staff. For example, the staff officers did not think about this operation. It was not prepared. Moreover, it is believed that none of the high command even knew about it. And for a long time, people didn't even think about this chapter of history. Now, there are a lot of unknown situations, unique information from eyewitnesses. Chapter 2, Moscow is behind us. From Volokholamsk, Minsk, through the Warsaw Highways, and at the beginning of World War II, soldiers mostly fought along the roads. The fascists intended to win over the Soviet Union fast. Soldiers could walk 100 kilometers in just one day. In Europe, sometimes even more. But in the Soviet Union, they didn't see such rapid progress. The Moscow region is made of forest and wetlands. There aren't many roads. Nazi soldiers finally stumbled on the approaches to Moscow. There was a mudslide in October, and it was impossible to cross these lands on tanks and cars. Where tanks found it easier to pass, motor vehicles and motorcycles couldn't. They required good roads. Accordingly, in settlements, so-called resistance was created. The Warsaw Highway, Yuknov. Soviet troops were leaving the city. It was left without a fight. They too could safely get into cars and go to Moscow, and no one would condemn them. But they decided otherwise. Commandos of Commander Starchak, they took the explosives from the warehouse and stayed. With them was a veteran from Almaty, Semyon Kalinin. I served before the war in the army, in the paratrooper 214 Airborne Brigade, from the 4th Amphibious Corps. In the Minsk region, Bukovitsky market town, there's special training. One must not only die for the motherland, but defend it till the last drop of blood. That's what these paratroopers learn during their training. A commander always worries that he will lead people into battle who are not trained properly. We were always preparing to defend our homeland. We jumped with a parachute day and night. Once I had a case where I jumped with a big parachute and covered a rabbit. I caught it, but it ran away. Everyone laughed. They learned sabotage work, and soon it came in handy. On June the 22nd, they fought enemy troops. The men were dressed in our army uniform and police. Then the order to remain behind the enemy as a diversionary group. We declared war on the fascists, a rail war. We blew up the railways. I participated in it. We blew up the bridge. The fact is, we detained 28 divisions, as Konev Marshal said. They're the parts that were in the Belarusian forests and swamps. These parts of the Belarusian forests were in the beginning of October in the town of Yuknov near Moscow. Chapter 3. Stand at the post. There's no definitive, complete list of who was in the squad, and no one knows the names of the soldiers. In Soviet times and in general, this type of troops were kept in secret. Many have remained unknown heroes in the battle for Moscow. Starchak himself subsequently wrote that he no longer remembers the names, and he didn't know all of them, and he did not want to make them public anyway. Presumably there were 430 soldiers, probably plus minus 10 people, 200 cadets, 150 Komsomol members, and several dozen well-trained paratroops from the 214th Division. We were given orders to defend Moscow. The order was given, but how to do it was not known. There were at least 12,000 fascists in this direction, and the airborne detachment was the only obstacle in the enemy's way. On the Warsaw Highway, there were no Soviet Unions. I showed my comrades a sign plucked from the roadside post. The figure is 205. So many kilometers to Moscow. Fascists expect to get there on tanks and cars in a few hours. Ivan Starchak, From Heaven to Battle. Our commander said that there are 205 kilometers to Moscow and a tank column will take 4 to 5 hours and we must stop them. There was no other way. There were no anti-tank guns either, only grenades and rifles. There was no connection with the army headquarters, and the chances of surviving were the same. Against paratroopers, there were artillery, aircraft, and tanks. The tank army under the leadership of General Guderian, breaking down everything in their way, went into the Soviet Union very deeply. Soviet soldiers lacked weapons, which was a catastrophe. Up to the point that the arms of the individual regiments were French cannons of 1897, which came from them, to the trophy depots left after the Polish and Romanian armies, after the Red Army's campaign to Poland and Bessarabia in 39 to 40. It was especially difficult to fight tanks. After all, of anti-tank weapons, we only had bundles of grenades and bottles with flammable liquid. Only a well-chosen place for defense and resistance of paratroopers allowed restraining the onslaught of the enemy. Ivan Starchak, From Heaven to Battle. The fire of the machine guns stopped the enemy column. Armored cars and motorcycles blocked the tanks. The account at that time was on the clock, literally. Even a small delay of the enemy allowed the main Soviet troops to regroup and gain a foothold in defensive positions. Yukhnov took place between the 5th and 9th of October in 1941. The famous generals retreated and 400 people stood on the defense. It seems incredible, but over 5 days they held back the enemy's army of 12,000 soldiers. 10 motorcycles appeared on the motorway, 4 armored cars, 2 tanks, 10 open trucks with infantry were driving behind them. And then again, tanks. We counted 15 of them. Perhaps there were more, but the tail of the column wasn't visible. Ivan Starchak, From Heaven to Battle. Minefields and landing raids on the enemy's side, and the fascists decided they were the larger army in front of them and pulled up artillery. Our people were very smart. They removed the mufflers from the cars, and without them, the cars sounded like tanks. Another attack was repulsed, and the weather was incredibly cold on top of everything. It was freezing cold. Nazi generals tied some of the paratroopers to the trees and said, "This will be your fate if you don't surrender." They did not give up, despite the threats of the fascist generals. The headquarters of the Soviet army for a long time could not understand who was delaying the advance of enemy troops. And then they remembered about the squad of paratroopers. Marshal Borodino called them desperate, but did not give any reinforcements. There were 400 people in the squad, but afterwards only 60 people were left. I was wounded as well. On October the 9th, I had to leave my position. We were able to gain 5 days, allowing Soviet troops to better organize the defense on the outskirts of Moscow. But about the brave deed of 400 people in one of the main directions on the front, there was only a small note in the newspaper. Epilogue: those who are not afraid of typhoons. The victory parade on Red Square still took place on November the 7th, 1941. One of the participants was Gabas Zhumatov. We stood about 30 to 40 kilometers away from Moscow, and here we were taken from the front right into the parade. They say that when Hitler heard about it on the radio, he was furious. How did his troops allow this to happen? Immediately after the parade, again, Soviet soldiers were back on the front line. They needed to stop the typhoon. And how many more of such little-known deeds were there? They say that at the front the soldiers slightly altered Lermontov's poem, and we promised to die, and we pledged our oath of loyalty in the battle near Moscow.